Welcome, everyone, to the National Women's History Museum presents Live in Conversation with author Dr. Blain. I am so excited for this discussion today, and I thank you all for joining us. My name is Emily Kirschbaum, and I'm the Assistant Director of Strategic Programs and Education at the museum. And I am so honored that we have not only Dr. Blain, who is going to join us, her forthcoming book, Without Fear. It is out now, actually, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights, and moderating the discussion and asking questions today will be Gloria L. Blackwell, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the AAUW and has been so for the last 21 years. And together they will explore the legacy, impact, and continued relevance of Black women's activism across generations. And I find it so particularly apt that not only is Dr. Blain studying those things, but Gloria is also doing those things. And so to see that beautiful marriage of this conversation, I just can't wait. Gloria, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kirschbaum. I'm excited to be here for this amazing conversation. It really is my pleasure to be here with all of you today for what will certainly be a great conversation. It really is my pleasure to once again engage with and lift up the work of AAUW Fellowship alumna, professor, researcher, and author, Dr. Keisha Blain. Welcome, Dr. Blain. It's good to see you. So Dr. Blain's new book, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights, highlights the pivotal yet often overlooked role that Black women have played in shaping global human rights movements. Welcome, Dr. Blain. You can turn on your camera and your mic and join us. So good to see you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, and so I'm very excited to have this conversation about this great book. I've read the book and I've certainly listened to, many of the podcasts and other interviews that we have done. So let's go ahead and get started. My first question really is about what was the motivation that you had to write this book?
Well, thank you again, and thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us virtually. I actually started writing Without Fear while I was in the process of finishing my previous book entitled Until I Am Free. And this is a book on civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer. As so many people know, Hamer played a pivotal role in expanding Black political rights, certainly very, I think, a key figure in terms of understanding the fight for voting rights. But one of the things that became quite clear to me as I was writing Until I'm Free is that it's important to think about Hamer not only in the national context, which is to say that we have to think about her contribution not solely pertaining to U.S. history, but really think about her as a global thinker, as a human rights activist. And I started grappling with these themes in that book. One of the chapters that I write about that I write in Until I'm Free grapples with Hamer as an internationalist. And I talk about her travels to Guinea in '64 and how that shapes her political vision, how she draws connections between what's taking place in Mississippi and what's taking place in the Congo at the time. And all that is to say that I was very interested in this notion of how did Black women envision human rights? So that was one question. How did they uh, work to shape human rights history? And effectively how they attempted to make it their own, how they drew inspiration from this concept and ultimately used it to fuel their activism on the local, on the national, and on the global stage. And so it really is perfect to be able to now talk about this book coming off of the Hamer book, because in so many ways, the two books are in conversation. Most people will be surprised to know that I don't talk about Hamer in Without Fear. I mentioned her briefly and simply quoting her. And I did so intentionally because I really wanted to send a message that truly this is a vast history. There's so many Black women who could be highlighted and should be highlighted in the story. And I wanted to introduce an array of intellectuals and thinkers. But it's certainly people will see the themes, I think, between the previous book and this new one.
Thank you. I love that. So how do you think your book challenges what we know about Black women's political history?
Well, there's so much to say here. I think oftentimes when we're thinking about political history, we are thinking about the more formal political process.
Mhm.
So a lot of the conversations around Black women's politics has certainly been around Black women in terms of voting rights. And to be sure, that is a very important topic. We see the work of someone like fellow historian Martha Jones, who's written a great book, Vanguard, in which she's really helping us see how Black women are very much deeply invested in the struggle for voting rights, and showing us that this is very much a long history. And that is an important aspect of the narrative, to be sure. But part of what I'm interested in is not so much formal politics, but informal politics, the way that people work to affect change from the ground up, but also the way people work to affect change at a moment where they don't actually have full access to the ballot. And that's one aspect to consider. The other thing, too, is how people are thinking globally and how they're doing so despite the many challenges they're facing on the local and on the national. And so here is where I'm pushing to the forefront many women, including those who are fairly well known in the narrative, but I'm talking about them through a different lens. So, for example, I talk about Madam C.J. Walker, very important figure, but my discussion is very much about thinking about her internationalism, essentially thinking about her travels. I talk about, for example, her travel to Haiti, the moment she's visiting political prisoners, just very important moments in her story that I think we should spend more time focusing on. And I surely want to give a shout out to Elia Bundles, who's just done remarkable research and writing on Madam C.J. Walker. And then my book is certainly in conversation and thinking about Walker, as well as so many others who we often do talk about within the national context, but don't often, I think, grapple with their global work, their internationalism, the way that they are forging transnational alliances, the way that they are thinking globally, the way that they are framing their arguments through the lens of human rights, which is to say that it's not a question about citizenship. And it's not, and of course, citizenship matters. But part of the argument that many of these women are making is that the claim for citizenship rights, that it's too narrow, quite frankly. And what Black women are advocating, or human rights, to say that there are God-given protections that are due to each person simply on the basis of their humanity. And that is what the argument is. And that is why lynching must end, right? This is what Ida B. Wells argues in the 19th century. That is why Black people should have access to quality health care, to educational opportunities, and so on. And so part of this story is thinking about politics from below, but also thinking about politics not solely confined to the nation state, but thinking about politics moving in new directions, linking to what's happening globally. And I think all of that is an important part of this book, and certainly the larger body of scholarship that I'm committed to writing.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think it really is about the fact that being engaged in politics doesn't necessarily mean that you have to hold a political office, right?
Right.
Caring about human rights doesn't mean that you have to be a part of a bigger organization. It really is
Correct.
about these individuals that you write so much about in the research, which is quite amazing, connecting them to the human rights piece. So you go as far back as the 19th century in the book. Was it challenging to find documents and records to flesh out the stories of the Black women at that time? And within the book, whose story is the oldest that you tell?
Mm. Yes, that's a great question. So many things that I would emphasize. I think on the one hand, I was able to certainly utilize a number of archives across the country. And thankfully, we do have some material on Black women's writing, certainly on their speeches, and that helps to tell this story. I also rely on the Black press. So being able to go through historical newspapers, that was another wonderful source to be able to use for this book. And I had to rely heavily on census records too, especially in piecing together the lives of women who are lesser known in the narrative and having to figure out where they were born, where they lived, who were these individuals, what are the groups that they were involved in. These are the kinds of questions I could answer only by going directly through city directories or going through just a range of public records that might be available. So being able to blend all of these, I think sources help to be able to tell the story. And uh, it's an interesting, I think, process because on the one hand, when I was starting to do the research for these earlier chapters and thinking about the 19th century, I had many people say to me, well, human rights isn't really a thing in the 19th century, is it? Which I thought was a fascinating comment because I think part of what is happening when someone says this is that they're thinking very narrowly about what human rights is. So that's the first thing. Some people say to me, well, what is human rights before the United Nations? And that's a fair question. Well, this book answers that question. The other thing, too, is that there are scholars who have spent a lot of time focusing on the actual term human rights, and pretty much arguing that if it's not being used, right, it's not happening, and that they're only able to track it when they can find it in a newspaper, for example. There are scholars who say, oh, well, in the 1970s, we see an uptick with the use of the term and in these different places, and that means certain things. And it's not to discount that. I think it's important to think about language and how we talk about things. But part of what I'm asking is, well, what if we pay attention to the core tenets, essentially? What are the core values? What is human rights to the core? And if we focus on those particular strands, and here I'm pointing out specifically in the book equal rights, universal rights, and natural rights. If we're thinking about human rights through that lens, and just to give context for those who are listening, I'm in framing it this way. I'm drawing on an amazing book written by a fellow historian, Lynn Hunt, called "Inventing Human Rights," and she points out these three core concepts. But as I'm going through the primary sources, I'm looking for evidence of that. And so I'm able to talk about Maria Stewart in the 1830s, and she's one of the earlier figures that I discuss in the book. I'm able to talk about how she is thinking about universal rights, equal rights, and natural rights. And she's doing so uh, through her speeches. She's talking about these things. She's making an argument that slavery must come to an end. And it's not solely that it must come to an end. And of course, there are all of these reasons that she's emphasizing. She's drawing inspiration from the Bible. She's thinking about just the humane aspect of it. And part of what she's arguing is, well, it has to come to an end because this is not how you treat people, right? This is not how you treat others if you recognize their humanity, if you recognize their human dignity, and failure to do so really is a failure that has to be addressed, and quite frankly, that needs to be discussed on a global scale because the United States cannot project to the world to be some kind of beacon of anything, whether democracy or freedom, when slavery exists on U.S. soil as just one way. And so I grappled a lot with her words, the messages she was sending, and what I saw very clearly was the way that she was thinking about human rights at a moment where people didn't even want to hear a Black woman speak in public, let alone point out the hypocrisy in American thinking and society around these issues. And as we know in the case of Maria Stewart, she was forced to retreat from public office because of the resistance to everything that she was saying at the time. So her story is one that I spend considerable time with. And then I draw a connection between her words, her writings, to Ida B. Wells in the late 19th century. And we see the ways that the Wells, she's making similar arguments as she's traveling through the UK and thinking about how to point out the horrors of lynching. Part of it is saying, listen, this is a human rights abuse. And we know that because we can see the connection between lynchings and what's taking place in Cuba, what's taking place, genocide that's happening in other parts of the globe. She spells that out in her writings and in her speeches, but I don't think we've paid a lot of attention to that as scholars. And so this book is really an opportunity to get people to think about these significant figures in a new light.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I know, and one of the things that I noticed in the book as well is that, some of the readers might be surprised that the human rights you write about, as you mentioned, it's just not about what's encompassed within the U.S. civil rights movement.
Right.
And the women that you've already mentioned, that we write about how they fought for the rights of people in so many countries around the world. And so what were sort of some of the most surprising sort of transnational and global links that you found?
So many. One that I think a lot about is the story of Margaret Cartwright, and perhaps we'll talk about her some more too. And for those who aren't familiar, Margaret Cartwright, she wears many hats. So this is in the 1950s. She's a professor at Hunter College. She's also a columnist for the Pittsburgh Courier and also for the New York Amsterdam News. She's a correspondent for the UN. She does many things. One of the things that I find remarkable about her is that she's intentionally going to different places and really centering, making sure that she's present in certain spaces where Black women and oftentimes Black people, but specifically Black women don't have much of a voice. So what do I mean? She travels to Indonesia in 1955. She's attending the Bandung Conference. We understand in historical context that this is a significant gathering for certainly, I think, broadly, people of African descent, people of Asian descent. We talk about it as a pivotal moment in the larger history of Afro-Asian solidarity. Here you have a Black woman. She was born in Cambridge, and she, very talented, skillful, educated Black woman, but she's there just to observe, essentially. She's taking notes. She's listening to the conversations that are taking place. And then what she's doing is she's coming back to the United States, and she's writing about her experiences, and she's writing about what she sees as the significance of Bandung for a Black American audience, making a case that Black Americans need to be thinking about what's taking place in Bandung because that is part of the larger struggle for human rights, and the fight for civil rights on U.S. soil will be incomplete if Black Americans aren't also thinking about the global developments that are taking place at the very same time that they're making these arguments, right? Think about the Bandung Conference of 55 happening in the same year as the Brown, well, actually, the Brown decision is 54, but 55 is the Montgomery bus boycott. I'm just really trying to get people to think through what's happening within the U.S. borders, but also what's happening globally. And someone like Margaret Cartwright, she's drawing those connections. And then she goes later, she attends the All African Peoples Conference, which is in Accra, Ghana in 58. She's one of about 8 women who are present. She's not on the program, she's not speaking, she's not given an opportunity to share her thoughts. And yet I talk about her intentionally to show once again the informal politics. When you don't have the mic in your hand, when you don't have a seat at the table, how do you still make sure that your voice is heard? And she shows us how. She attends, she listens, she gathers information, and she goes back and using journalism as a tool, and in many ways building on the legacy of someone like Ida B. Wells. I'm fascinated by the way she's blending both reporting and what we would talk about today as the op-ed. So it's not just, well, here's what I saw, here's what I heard, here's what Kwame Nkrumah said in this setting, but it's actually, here's what he said and here's why it matters, and here's what I think. I agree or I disagree. I think this should be the focus, and I think this other thing should be the focus. So it's a really amazing, I think, archive in and of itself to grapple with her writings. And it just shows how someone whose name we may not know, who doesn't have the kinds of official positions that we would focus on, and who happens to be marginalized in the larger history, she really comes up in any of these moments I just mentioned, still plays a pivotal role. And I try to tease out these stories to get people to think about human rights, activism, and advocacy differently.
It's great. I think that, Marguerite Cartwright certainly was, a trailblazer and someone who did that travel and who opened up that space and provided more information so that people had a better perspective
Hmm.
of what was going on. Obviously it's not just about our own country, right?
Right.
It's about the rest of the world. So I was in New York City a few weeks ago for the UN General Assembly.
Hmm.
The United Nations is turning 80 years old this fall. And you tell the stories of Black women who worked at the UN, worked there sort of right from the very beginning. And why was their presence not only notable, but important
Hmm.
in shaping the institution?
Yes, so many things to say. One person who, of course, I talk about is Mary McLeod Bethune.
Mhm.
And I think her name is certainly very recognized in the historical records, certainly, and I think in mainstream historical narratives. As we know, she played a pivotal role in the drafting of the Charter for the United Nations. That is certainly the story. I do tell this story, but I also weave in the stories of other Black women, including women who simply showed up to take notes. And you perhaps notice a pattern, the way that I pay attention to the people who may seem somewhat insignificant in the story, but I show how they are, in fact, quite significant to the story. I talk about someone by the name of Sabella Culpepper, who is someone I didn't even know about until I started writing this book. I came across her because there were a series of newspaper articles talking about this woman who is working at the United Nations. She's a secretary. And on the one hand, I'm thinking, well, why is there so much coverage about, this woman? Well, part of what's happening is she she is taking notes. She doesn't have a perhaps grand title or position that maybe others would consider um, of same equal, of excuse me, of um, equivalence rather to maybe a diplomat or someone else. And yet, one of the reasons why she's getting all this attention in the Black press is because she's defying all of these expectations. Think about the context, and this is 1946, in fact, is when she starts working for the United Nations. So very, very early in the history. Think about what it means to have all of these meetings with dignitaries and world leaders coming together to talk about an array of issues. And in the midst, and there are all of these moments where I talk about that Culpepper or also her colleague Priscilla McDonald, the only Black woman in the room, the only Black woman in the room, and there to take notes. But part of the reason why there's so much attention broadly is because people see it as a step. They see it as a step forward. They think about what it means to have a Black woman in the space and what it means to simply be present, even if your presence might be marginalized. For some people, their very presence gives hope and inspiration. And in fact, that's the way Black journalists write about these women in these very glowing terms because it signals to them that change is coming. Because it's only a matter of time, right, that we go from the Black woman taking notes in the room to the Black woman doing a whole lot more. And you see the progression, you see change over time in which Black women are doing an array of things by the time we get to the latter part of the 1940s. Black women are involved in the nation and with the United Nations at multiple levels, but it's really sitting with those early years and the people whose names don't appear in the history books, or at least didn't until the release of this book. That to me is a powerful part of the story. And I hope people are thinking through, once again, how human rights as a theme just become so central to many of these women's lives, even as they are struggling to make a claim for citizenship, because we're still talking about a period where many of these women, most of these women, did not have access to the vote. Um, Years that we're talking about, decades before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and yet they are making strides in these small but significant ways.
Absolutely. And it was definitely one of the most striking parts of the book for me, because I do have a great love, a desire for the United Nations, international affairs, and international development, and learning so many of these new things was just absolutely fascinating. And I think that noting that having the Black woman in the room taking the notes was quite powerful, and it was then that transition to not just being in the room taking the notes, right, moving
Right.
on to being the leaders and having their voices heard, which is really, really, really key. So I'm going to shift a bit and talk about another striking thing in the book is about the women on the book, is that how many of them were not wealthy uh, or from families of means. They may not have had much formal education or connections to, sort of notable people, but they worked as much as they could to try to move human rights forward. Can you highlight just one of those stories?
Yes, one of the women who I discussed in the book is a woman by the name of Pearl Sherrod. And um, to your point of having limited resources, this was a working class, or perhaps more specifically, a working poor Black woman from Detroit. I talk about her in the context of the 1930s. And I should say, I've been really interested in Pearl Sherrod for a long time. I first learned about her when I was writing my dissertation, now more than 10 years ago. But I was determined to find out more, and I've been digging over the last couple of years. And part of what I do in Without Fear is I talk about how this ordinary Black woman from Detroit, how she shows up at this conference in 1937. This is the Pan Pacific Association Women's Conference that's taking place in Vancouver. And 1937, Pearl Sherrod shows up. She's not invited to the conference. No one actually knows who she is. But she shows up to the conference and she walks to the front, goes to the podium, and she starts speaking. She calls out the women in the room, and the women in the room are a combination of white women and women of Asian descent. There are no Black women present. And part of what Sherrod does is she pretty much takes them to task, and she says to them that there will be no peace. There will be no peace, no unity. And I'm paraphrasing that your whole conception of rights um, really will mean nothing if you don't take into consideration the lives and experiences of Black women. It's a way of helping them understand long before the term intersectionality became popular. It's a way of her saying, actually, we've got to think about the multiple ways in which people experience oppression. And you can't talk about women's rights. You can't talk about women's rights in this transnational space and yet exclude Black women. And it's such a powerful moment. And one of the reasons I'm able to write about it is that multiple people talk about this. They talk about how it makes them feel, those who are attendees at the conference, how they are shocked by this Black woman who they don't know showing up and scolding them, but moving them to act. And some experience guilt, and some feel sadness, and some feel ashamed. But we go from feelings then to actions, because then I also talk about in the book how the group decides that they will, in fact, open up a space for Black women. And so all that is to say, an ordinary Black woman who has no connection to a particular group becomes aware they're gathering, shows up, crashes the party, so to speak, and in so doing, opens up a space for other Black women to then be able to attend these gatherings and talk about the issues that they're dealing with. So it's one way of really expanding the concept of human rights, and doing so at the grassroots level. And Sharad is a fascinating figure as I really work through her life because she's interested in Afro-Asian solidarity. She's specifically interested in a connection between Black Americans and Japan, a very risky kind of position to hold in the 1930s and then into the 1940s. Uh, you could already imagine the kind of surveillance that she was dealing with at the time because of her politics framed as far too radical for the moment. But I do think her story is important and part of why I center it here alongside of someone like Margaret Cartwright, the professor, is to help people see that this isn't just a story about middle class or elite Black women. They are absolutely part of this narrative, but it's also a story about how people who don't necessarily know how they will make ends meet are also thinking about these broader issues that are facing their communities, but also that they're grappling with and thinking through in an international sense. And that to me is such a fascinating aspect. I think we live in a society where it's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking, okay, I have to be only concerned about my issue, my community, my space, my family. And it's not to discount the need to take care of your people and your own community. And that needs to happen. But I'm just struck by these women's ability to move at multiple registers, to say, I will attend to right the bread and butter issues. I will talk about what I need, what my community needs, but I also need to pay attention to what's happening across the ocean because in fact, what's happening across the ocean is deeply intertwined with what I'm dealing with on the local level. And to be able to see that right, with limited formal education, with limited access to resources, completely shut out of these formal and traditional spaces, that to me is a truly remarkable story that gets us right back to the power of these informal political moments in the history.
Yeah, definitely Sherrod's story was very, very interesting. And as you said, an individual who does not appear in most history books, right?
Right.
You also wrote about Aretha McKinley from DC. Can you tell us a little bit more about her life and her achievements? I'd never heard of
Yes.
her.
Yes, and I have to say I had never heard of her either, which was that's of course the exciting part of doing
Hmm.
research and writing. I had a list of women in my mind, and I thought I knew exactly what I was going to do, and then I uncovered many others. But Aretha McKinley was in fact a lobbyist, lived in DC. I really talk about her in the context of her work. She became the director of the American Council on Human Rights. Um, and this is a coalition of African American Greek letter organizations. Very, I think, fascinating group in and of itself because part of what the council was doing was getting people to think about the connection between civil and human rights. It was sending a message that that these two are connected, these two are deeply intertwined. We have to push people, we have to push for expanding voter rights, but at the same time, we also need to be in dialogue with activists in the Caribbean and Latin America. We need to be thinking about colonialism on the African continent. So it was just deeply internationalist in its focus. And Aretha McKinley became the director in the early 60s. And so I talk about her work with the council, but then I also talk about her just at the individual level, the way that she's moving back and forth. She's hosting workshops at Howard University, as an example, in which she's talking about both the national context, what's happening on US soil, and also informing people about what's happening globally and helping them make the connections for themselves. The way she's also challenging, another aspect of the story, there are all these class dimensions. And one of the things that she does at one point, she's going to sororities, and she's telling them, listen, the work that we have to do around human rights advocacy is so important that we need to put all of our money in this direction. There's a moment where she says to them, instead of hosting these elaborate, galas and parties and so on, let's save the money instead of buying expensive clothing to wear at these gatherings, let's actually save our money and invest it in spreading this message about the importance of linking civil and human rights. It really is, to my point, a grassroots kind of work from someone who doesn't get much attention now in the contemporary moment, but appeared in all of these newspapers at the time, which is how I came across her. There was a piece about her in Jet magazine. There were multiple profiles on her. People were just so inspired by her as this passionate lobbyist who's just thinking right at these I mentioned the multiple registers, but it's just the power of the ability to move seamlessly from thinking about local politics to national politics to global politics. And she did that effort, in this way that it just seemed so effortless. So I highlight her story, and I also I mentioned the social aspects. I talk about the parties that she was. So on the one hand, she's telling people, let's save money and let's not host parties. That's at one moment. But then later in her life, she is actually hosting all of these dinner parties. And at first I'm thinking, okay, what's happening here? But she's hosting these dinner parties and she's reaching out to people. She's inviting people from all over the world, and she's making connections. And it just shows the way that uh, people can, I think, play a part. At times it's dramatic, it's visible, it's out in the open, and then at times it's just quietly behind the scenes. A dinner party in which you connect. In one case, Aretha McKinley, she's connecting local, African American activists in DC. She's connecting them with um, an activist from Togo who's visiting, but she wants to make sure that the two are in conversation as they think about these broader issues. So it just becomes, I think, a fascinating way to look at how these women engage in human rights advocacy and oftentimes use very creative methods to do it.
Yes, definitely. She's a very interesting woman, and knowing that she was really so dedicated to the human rights piece, and also the way of engagement, may not have been so traditional, but making sure that she was utilizing her contacts and making sure that those connections were actually having the opportunity to connect with each other. I
Hmm.
love that part as well. Now, you spoke earlier about Marguerite Cartwright, who really is a fascinating journalist, scholar, and activist. And one of the things that was noted is that, so you were the first person to access her archives at the Amistad Research Center, right? Um, I just wonder, seeing those amazing documents, how did it really impact your ability to tell her story? And how did it sort of give you the firsthand, access to be able to
Hmm.
tell that story? What insight did seeing them give you?
Yeah, so and I first learned about Margaret Cartwright maybe maybe 2015, so actually 10 years now. And at the time, um, researchers at the Amistad Research Center at Tulane in New Orleans had reached out to me because they were in the process of processing the papers, and they wanted me to become aware of it. And they were also just trying to rally support. They were also seeking funding to be able to make the material accessible and available to the public. One of the things that struck me at the time is that I had never heard of her, and I was at the time when I found out about her. I was teaching at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was struck by the fact that she was a columnist for the Pittsburgh Courier, but I had not encountered that before. Um, I knew certainly that there was a lot that I could talk about in terms of her writing. She was so prolific. So once I realized she was writing for all these newspapers, she was also writing journal articles. I thought, okay, this is exciting, and there's a lot that one could do in the future. What's really great about the collection, though, is that it gives us a window into her life far beyond the written text, but it also gives us a sense of her relationships with an array of individuals, as an example. Or there are things that I learned about her through the collection that I simply would not know. In addition to an array of photos, I was able to find out small things such as her apartment, the way she would travel across the globe, and she would always bring back something to, as a way to remember a particular trip. And so her apartment would be filled with just an array of items as she's traveling, throughout Ghana, Nigeria. She's bringing back all of these things. I learn about the way that she dresses, right? These are things that show up in the archive that are not clear, of course, when you're just looking at the person's writings. I learned that at one point she changes the way she dresses because she's trying to demonstrate her solidarity with Africans on the continent. And so she starts wearing African print at one point, and as a way to signal that deep connection. And she's of course a Pan-Africanist, so all of that comes to light as I'm looking at the collection. I think being able to learn more about her relationships, it's quite extraordinary to see letters coming to her from world leaders, and writing to her, and her writing back in this very intimate way, and thinking, wow, she really knew uh, these folks. It wasn't just, like that they met once at a conference, or but just this deeply personal connection, and thinking about what that meant in the context of the 1950s or 60s for a Black woman to have that kind of access to, and the ability to offer advice or suggestions, and sometimes she's doing that. So I think the collection helped me see certainly a more personal aspect of, the kind of the inner life. To be sure, there are still silences. There are things we may never know. There's a moment where I talk about in the book where she's writing about she's writing almost as if she's responding to someone, but it's not clear who she's responding to. And she's saying, "Listen, I'm still a professor, at Hunter College. I still teach my classes, and I'm committed to that." And she's trying to explain essentially how she's able to do all that she's doing, and the tone with which she's responding suggests that someone's critiquing, whether it's a public critique, whether it's a private critique. She's feeling the pressure that maybe some people feel like she's traveling too much, and maybe she's not attentive to her classes, or maybe she's not attentive to her marriage, and she's pushing back, saying, "No, I'm actually doing all of these things to the best of my ability, and they all matter to me." So I think the collection was really wonderful to give me a full sense of who she was, far beyond the writer, the intellectual. It was nice to get a sense of her personality, her relationships, even with her husband. Nice to think through the dynamics between the two. She was in an interracial union, so just thinking about what it meant for her as a Black woman, married to a white man at a moment where it was still somewhat taboo in certain circles and not fully accepted. So she was also navigating those kinds of personal challenges. And the archive was just a wonderful, um, I think, opportunity to get to know her as a person. And I certainly hope that people will write more. I know that other researchers have since, of course, been to the collection, and perhaps we'll see more writings on her in the near future.
Very interesting, and just a fascinating woman. And I'm really so glad that you were able to access those documents and share so much of that information, that people just did not know or didn't have access to. So from Walker to Sherrod to Cartwright, you tell so many amazing stories and in the book. And some might say that looking at American history through the lens of a marginalized group does a disservice to the bigger American story. Can you explain why this isn't the case, and sort of what you want the readers of the book to come away with?
Hmm. Well, one of the things that I point out, I think, in the introduction is something that I've thought deeply about, which is that much of the history that we know, much of the mainstream narratives on human rights,
Mhm.
are told through the ideas and experiences um, of white men, and actually often European thinkers. So there is, I think, a way in which we talk about the contributions of someone like Friedrich Nietzsche as just an example, and it's both foreign in one sense, coming into, right, sort of coming into the United States. And then on the other sense, the focus will be often on individuals who already have a place of prominence and power in the society. And that's just the facts of the matter. So what does it mean then to take a look at the history through the lens of those who are marginalized, who by no choice of their own, right, find themselves in many ways, I think, at various moments at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, simply because of inequality, certainly economic inequality, also racism, and just a range of factors that shape these women's lives. I think that since we already have so many narratives that center the dominant voice, that it's important to be able to now tell the stories of those who have not been centered, and to show that the history is a far more diverse and far more nuanced narrative. And then it helps us, I think, move beyond this idea that, well, some people shaped human rights history, and some people are important to the narrative, and others might have just been spectators, or they didn't contribute in any meaningful way. I think the historical record shows us that that particular perspective is not accurate. And I think if we're committed to, at least for those of us who are committed to building a kind of multiracial and inclusive society that allows space for everyone, then it means that the history we tell will need to reflect that too. So I think this is an important book, despite the many challenges of the moment. I think it helps us see how those with limited influence and power still found ways to enact change, and therefore we're powerful in other ways too, and so we can really grapple with 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 not just legacy and influence, but to an extent with power, right? That it may look differently, but it's still powerful to be able to move the conversation forward even when you don't have a seat at the table. So I think it just enhances the history, enriches it, and helps us understand better all of these dynamics.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this conversation. We do have a comment from guess whom? Alelia Bundles, who says, congratulations on your new
Thank
book, and
you.
thank you for your incredible research on these
Thank
important
you.
women and opening our eyes to their impact. Thank you also for your kind words about my Madam Walker research and for including her in the book. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Alelia Bundles. We certainly, anytime we can get amazing research around Madam Walker is really, really important. She certainly had so much of an influence and had so much that she accomplished, and we look up to her still to this day. So we really do appreciate you lifting her up, Dr. Blain. And I don't think we have any other questions, so I want to thank you once again for this amazing conversation. I want to encourage those who have read the book to share it with others, and also just to make sure that you look at the other works that Dr. Blain has taken care of as well, and the research that she has done. It really is important that we do sort of highlight, as she does, the pivotal yet often overlooked role that Black women have played in shaping the global human rights movements. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for spending so much time with us here at the National Women's History Museum. This is a recorded event, so it will be posted again on our website, and I encourage everybody to stay up to date with the things that we're doing here at the museum by joining in our newsletter. But again, this was such an incredible time spent with such incredible women sharing such powerful stories. So again, thank you to our panelists who are present here today. It was such a pleasure. But that is all I have for everyone here, and we hope to see you all soon in the next event that we host here.
Thank you.
Goodbye.